What if you could feel calmer, not because everyone around you changed, but because you stopped trying to control what was never yours to control? People make different choices. They may disagree with you, change their plans, misunderstand you, or choose a path you would never choose. Our natural reaction is often to explain, convince, argue, or worry. But what if there is another way to respond? In the Let Them theory by Mel Robbins, we explore a simple idea: when other people make choices you cannot control, let them. Then comes the more important question: what will you do? In this complete book summary audiobook, we'll break the key ideas into 5 sessions. We'll begin with the foundation of the Let Them idea, then explore how it applies to relationships, expectations, boundaries, emotional reactions, and everyday decisions. Finally, Session 5 will bring the major lessons together in one clear conclusion. This is not about becoming careless or accepting harmful behavior. It is about understanding the difference between what belongs to other people and what belongs to you, and using your own choices wisely. Stay with the complete summary, because the most powerful lesson may be the simplest: you cannot control everyone else, but you can choose how you respond. Session 1. Imagine this: someone makes a decision you don't like. They don't invite you. They disagree with you. They change their plans. They judge you. They choose a different path. What happens inside your mind? You may start asking, why did they do that? Why don't they understand me? How can I change their mind? What should I say? What if they make the wrong decision? And suddenly, someone else's choice is controlling your thoughts, emotions, and attention. This is where the central idea of the Let Them theory begins. Mel Robbins presents the Let Them idea as a mindset tool for recognizing what is, and what is not, in your control. Her basic argument is that when another person is making a choice that belongs to them, constantly trying to control that choice can consume your own time and emotional energy. The first step is surprisingly simple: let them. Let them have their opinion. Let them make their choice. Let them respond in their own way. Let them be different from what you expected. This does not mean that you have to agree with everything someone does. It does not mean that you have to remain silent when something genuinely needs to be addressed. And it does not mean allowing someone to treat you badly. The point is to recognize a boundary between their responsibility and yours. Think about a simple situation. You invite someone somewhere, and they say no. You cannot force them to want to come. You could spend hours feeling rejected, questioning yourself, or trying to convince them. Or you can recognize their choice and then decide what you want to do with your own time. That is the shift. Instead of asking, how do I make them change, you begin asking, what is actually in my control? Mel Robbins describes the second part of the framework as, let me. After letting other people make their own choices, you turn your attention toward your own choices, actions, and responses. Let me decide how I respond. Let me communicate clearly. Let me set an appropriate boundary. Let me step away when necessary. Let me focus on what I can actually influence. This creates an important distinction between accepting reality and approving of everything. You can accept that someone has made a choice without saying that the choice was right. You can recognize that another person is upset without taking responsibility for controlling their emotions. You can disagree with someone without spending all your energy trying to force them to think exactly like you. And this is where the theory becomes practical. Many difficult moments become exhausting because we fight against something that has already happened. Someone has already said no. Someone has already made their decision. Someone already has their opinion. Someone already reacted emotionally. You may not like the situation, but the fact remains that you cannot directly control another person's internal decisions. What you can control is what you do next. This does not mean becoming passive. In fact, Robbins emphasizes that the framework is not about simply giving up or allowing people to walk over you. The purpose is to stop wasting energy trying to manage other people and instead use that energy to decide your own response. Consider a disagreement. Your first instinct might be to win. You explain your position. They explain theirs. You explain again. They become more defensive. You become more frustrated. And eventually, the conversation becomes less about solving the problem and more about controlling who is right. The let them approach asks you to pause. They are allowed to have their perspective. You are allowed to have yours. Now ask, what response represents the person you want to be? That question brings responsibility back to you. The theory also becomes useful when expectations are involved. Sometimes the real source of frustration is not what another person did, but the fact that they did not behave according to the version of them that existed in our expectations. We expected them to call. We expected them to understand. We expected them to choose us. We expected them to react differently. When reality doesn't match those expectations, frustration appears. The solution is not necessarily to eliminate every expectation. It is to recognize when an expectation has turned into an attempt to control another person. That awareness gives you space to respond more thoughtfully. And there is another important lesson: other people's opinions do not automatically define your value. Someone may misunderstand you. Someone may criticize your decision. Someone may not approve of your choices. You can listen, consider useful feedback, and still make your own responsible decision. The goal is not to become indifferent to everyone. The goal is to stop handing over control of your inner peace every time someone else behaves differently from what you wanted. This is why the theory can be understood as a movement from control to responsibility. You stop trying to manage everyone else's behavior and start managing your own response. You stop asking, how can I make them? And start asking, what can I do? That change may sound small, but it changes the direction of your attention. Instead of spending your energy watching someone else, you bring your attention back to yourself. Instead of trying to predict their next move, you decide your next move. Instead of becoming trapped in their reaction, you decide how you want to respond. Of course, this principle has limits. Let them is not a rule that says every situation should simply be ignored. Robbins herself explains that there are situations where action and responsibility are necessary, particularly when safety or serious harm is involved. So the real question is not, should I let everything happen? The better question is this something I can responsibly control, influence, or respond to, or am I trying to control another person? That distinction is the foundation of this entire idea. And there is a deeper lesson behind it. Sometimes the freedom we want does not come from getting everyone to behave exactly as we wish. It comes from realizing that we were never responsible for controlling everyone in the first place. You cannot choose another person's thoughts. You cannot force another person's feelings. You cannot guarantee another person's decisions. But you can choose your own actions. You can choose your words. You can choose your boundaries. And you can choose how you respond. That is where the let them idea leads us, and in the next session, we'll take this principle deeper by looking at how it can affect relationships, expectations, and the emotional energy we give to other people. Note, this session is an original educational summary of the book's ideas, not a reproduction of its text. The discussion above contains no religious teaching or claim against Islam. It focuses on personal responsibility, emotional reactions, and interpersonal boundaries. Session 2. One of the most powerful places to understand the let them idea is in our relationships. Why? Because the people we care about often have the greatest ability to affect our emotions. A friend does not respond the way we expected. A family member disagrees with us. Someone we care about makes a decision we would not make. Or we keep hoping that a person will eventually become the version of them we want. And this is where frustration can quietly grow. Mel Robbins explains that the let them theory can help you stop trying to manage other people's choices and instead focus on your own response. Her official material describes the theory as a tool for relationships, boundaries, emotional energy, and personal growth. Consider a simple example. You invite a friend somewhere, but they choose not to come. You might immediately think, why don't they want to spend time with me? Then you may start checking their behavior, questioning the friendship, or trying to get an explanation. But their decision belongs to them. Let them. That does not mean you have to pretend you are not disappointed. You can acknowledge your feelings. You can communicate honestly. You can decide whether the friendship still meets your needs. But you don't have to spend all your energy trying to force another person to choose differently. This distinction becomes even more important when expectations enter a relationship. Sometimes we are not dealing with the person in front of us. We are dealing with the person we expect them to become. We imagine that one day they will understand us. One day they will change. One day they will finally behave differently. One day they will give us the relationship we have been hoping for. But if you build your decisions around a future version of someone, you may stop paying attention to the reality of who they are today. Robbins specifically emphasizes accepting people as they are rather than trying to force them to change, and then deciding how you want to respond to the relationship. That does not mean accepting every behavior. It means seeing reality clearly. Suppose someone repeatedly ignores a boundary you have clearly communicated. You cannot force them to respect it. But you can decide what you will do when the boundary is ignored. That is the let me part. Let me communicate. Let me establish a boundary. Let me decide what I am willing to accept. Let me choose how I participate in this relationship. Let me step back if necessary. This is where the theory becomes more than simply saying two words. Let them, without let me, could easily become passive. But the complete idea is different. Let them choose. Let me choose my response. That shift can change the way you handle disagreement. Imagine two people arguing. One person believes they are completely right, and the other person refuses to agree. If both people focus only on changing the other person's mind, the conversation can become a competition. But you can listen without surrendering your own judgment. You can disagree without attacking. You can explain your position without demanding agreement. And you can decide when continuing the argument is no longer useful. The goal is not to win every interaction. The goal is to respond intentionally. This is also relevant to other people's opinions. People will sometimes judge your decisions. They may not understand your goals. They may have expectations about what you should do with your life. You can listen to useful advice without giving every opinion authority over your choices. Someone else's opinion is information, not automatically a command. The same principle applies to comparison. If you constantly watch what other people are doing, their choices can become a measuring stick for your own life. You may start thinking, they are ahead of me, they have more, or, why isn't my life like theirs? The let them approach encourages you to release the need to control or compete with another person's path and return your attention to your own. Their progress is theirs. Your responsibilities are yours. Their decisions are theirs. Your decisions are yours. That does not mean you stop learning from others. In fact, other people's experiences can provide useful lessons. The important part is not allowing comparison to take away your ability to make thoughtful decisions for yourself. Relationships also become healthier when you stop assuming that love requires control. Caring about someone does not give you ownership over their decisions. You can care deeply and still recognize their independence. You can offer advice without demanding that it be followed. You can support someone without taking responsibility for every decision they make. And when someone chooses differently from what you hoped, you can decide what that choice means for your relationship. This is one reason Robbins describes the theory as a way to improve relationships. When you stop trying to control another person, you create more room to focus on how you show up yourself. But there is an important boundary. Let them should not be interpreted as ignore everything. If a situation involves serious harm, safety concerns, or behavior that requires action, simply standing aside is not the lesson. The principle is about separating what another person controls from what you responsibly control. You cannot control their decision. But you can decide what access they have to you. You cannot control their opinion. But you can decide whether you need to respond. You cannot control their emotions. But you can manage your own behavior. You cannot control whether someone changes. But you can decide whether you remain in the same situation. And that final point is powerful. Sometimes peace does not come from finally getting another person to understand you. Sometimes peace comes from accepting that they may never understand, and then making a responsible decision about what you will do next. The let them theory therefore shifts the question from how do I get them to change? To now that I see the situation clearly, what do I choose? That is where personal responsibility begins. And once you stop spending all your energy trying to control another person's choices, you have more energy available for your own relationships, goals, boundaries, and decisions. In the next session, we will take this idea deeper and examine what happens when other people's reactions, judgments, and expectations begin affecting your emotional state, and how the let them and let me approach can help you regain focus. Session 3. Sometimes another person does something small, yet it affects you for hours. A comment stays in your mind. Someone's reaction changes your mood. A friend's decision makes you question yourself. Or someone disagrees with you, and suddenly you feel the need to defend, explain, or prove your point. The let them theory asks you to look at this differently. You cannot control another person's thoughts, opinions, emotions, or behavior. But you can become more intentional about what you do with your own attention and energy. Mel Robbins describes this as shifting your focus away from controlling other people and back toward what you can control, your own response. Think about criticism. Someone criticizes your decision. Your first reaction may be to immediately defend yourself. But before responding, pause and ask. Do I actually need to change their opinion? Maybe their criticism contains something useful. Listen to it. Think about it. If there is a genuine lesson, use it. But if the opinion is simply an opinion, you do not have to spend the entire day trying to prove that you are right. Let them have their opinion. Let me decide what I do with it. This is not about becoming insensitive. It is about becoming selective with your emotional energy. Another powerful example is comparison. You see someone achieving something you wanted. Instead of focusing on your own path, your mind starts asking why they are ahead, why you are behind, or why your life does not look like theirs. But their journey is theirs. Let them succeed. Let them choose their priorities. Let them live their life. Then ask yourself, what do I want to do with mine? That question brings your attention back to where it can actually be useful. The same principle applies to other people's reactions. Someone becomes angry. Someone is disappointed. Someone disagrees. Someone does not approve. Their emotion may be real, but you are not automatically responsible for making that emotion disappear. Robbins emphasizes that the let me part means taking responsibility for your own thoughts, words, actions, and responses rather than managing someone else's emotional state. This can be difficult because many people confuse caring with controlling. You may think, if I really care about this person, I need to make sure they are happy. But you cannot guarantee another person's happiness. You can communicate respectfully. You can listen. You can support them. You can apologize when you are genuinely wrong. But you cannot take complete responsibility for another person's feelings. That distinction can protect relationships from unnecessary pressure. Now consider emotional reactions. When something triggers you, the emotion may appear automatically. The goal is not to pretend you never feel frustrated, disappointed, nervous, or hurt. The goal is to create enough space between the emotion and your response to choose what you do next. Robbins explains that emotional reactions can arise automatically, while your response, what you think, say, or do afterward, is where you have meaningful choice. So instead of immediately replying to an upsetting message, you can pause. Instead of continuing an argument, you can step away. Instead of assuming why someone behaved a certain way, you can ask. Instead of replaying the situation repeatedly, you can decide what action is actually necessary. This is where "let them" becomes practical. Suppose someone does not invite you to an event. Your mind might create an entire story. They don't like me. They must be talking about me. I must have done something wrong. But you do not actually know all of that. Robbins specifically warns against creating stories about why people behave the way they do and encourages clearer communication when understanding is genuinely needed. So let them make their choice. Then let me decide whether I need information. Maybe you ask calmly. Maybe you discover there was a simple reason. Maybe you learn something important about the relationship. Either way, you have replaced assumption with clarity. That is a major difference. Another important part of emotional freedom is recognizing when something deserves your attention and when it does not. Not every disagreement needs a response. Not every opinion needs an explanation. Not every criticism needs a defense. Not every situation deserves hours of mental energy. Your attention is limited. Where you repeatedly place it can influence what occupies your mind. The let them approach therefore encourages you to stop fighting battles that cannot produce a useful result. But remember the other half. Let me speak when speaking is necessary. Let me ask when clarification matters. Let me establish a boundary when a boundary is needed. Let me leave a conversation when continuing it is unproductive. Let me learn when criticism contains something useful. Let me ignore an opinion when responding would accomplish nothing. That is not weakness. That is deliberate choice. And boundaries are an important part of this process. Robbins explains that boundaries are not primarily about controlling another person's behavior, they are rules you set for your own participation. For example, you can decide how much time you spend in a situation or which conversations you are willing to participate in. This creates a healthier definition of control. Control does not mean making everyone behave the way you want. Control means knowing what belongs to you, and acting responsibly within that space. You cannot control the entire world around you. But you can choose your response. You can choose your communication. You can choose your boundaries. You can choose where your attention goes. And you can choose what deserves your energy. That is the deeper lesson of this session. The goal is not to stop caring about people. It is to stop making their every decision your personal responsibility. When you stop trying to control everyone else's reactions, you create room to understand yourself more clearly. And when you understand what is actually within your control, you can respond with greater intention instead of simply reacting. So the next time someone does something that immediately raises your emotions, pause for a moment. Say, "Let them." Then ask, what is my responsibility here? That second question is where your choice begins. And in the next session, we will take the idea further by looking at boundaries, difficult situations, and the important moments when "let them" should not be misunderstood as simply doing nothing. Session 4. The words "let them" sound simple, but they can easily be misunderstood. Does letting someone choose mean you should accept everything they do? Does it mean staying silent when someone crosses a boundary? Does it mean ignoring situations that genuinely require action? No. The deeper idea is to separate accepting what you cannot control from giving up your responsibility to respond. Mel Robbins emphasizes that "let them" is not about allowing people to mistreat you. It is about recognizing that you cannot control another person while still deciding what you will do for yourself. This is where boundaries become important. A boundary is not primarily a demand that another person behave exactly as you want. It is a decision about your own participation. For example, you cannot control whether someone wants to argue with you. But you can decide whether you will continue the argument. You cannot control what someone says about you. But you can decide whether you will engage with every comment. You cannot control whether someone respects your time. But you can decide how much time you give to a situation. That is the "let me" part. Let them choose. Let me choose my response. Mel Robbins specifically describes time and topics as useful areas for personal boundaries. You can decide how long you stay in a situation and which conversations you are willing to participate in. Imagine being in a conversation that repeatedly becomes stressful and unproductive. Instead of trying to force the other person to change their personality, you can say, in your own way, that you are not going to continue that particular conversation. You are not controlling them. You are controlling your participation. That distinction can make boundaries much clearer. Another important part of this theory is recognizing when action is necessary. Let them should never become an excuse to ignore serious problems. Mel Robbins has explicitly explained that there are situations where you should not simply stand aside, particularly when safety or serious harm is involved. So the principle is not let everything happen. It is recognize what you cannot control, then responsibly act on what you can. This is especially important when someone repeatedly crosses a clearly communicated boundary. You may not be able to make them respect it. But you can decide what you will do when it is crossed. That could mean ending a conversation, creating distance, changing your level of involvement, or seeking appropriate support when a situation is serious. The important point is that your boundary describes your action, not a command that magically controls another person. This also changes how we think about conflict. When someone becomes angry, your instinct may be to calm them down immediately. You might explain yourself again and again, apologize for things you did not do, or change your position simply because you dislike their reaction. But another person's emotional reaction is not something you can completely control. You can communicate respectfully. You can listen. You can correct yourself when you are genuinely wrong. But you do not have to surrender your judgment simply to prevent someone from becoming upset. This is where emotional maturity becomes important. Instead of reacting immediately, pause and ask. What is actually happening here? What part belongs to them? What part belongs to me? What response is responsible? Those questions can prevent a difficult moment from becoming a much larger conflict. The same principle applies to expectations. Sometimes we create boundaries in our minds but never communicate them. Then we become angry when another person violates a rule they did not even know existed. Clear communication matters. If something is important to you, explain it respectfully. If the other person chooses differently, you now have useful information. And that information allows you to make a decision. You cannot control their choice. But you can decide whether their choice changes your relationship with them. That is the power of the "let me" mindset. It brings the focus back to your own decisions instead of keeping you trapped in an attempt to manage someone else's behavior. There is another important lesson here: not every conversation deserves your participation. You do not have to answer every criticism. You do not have to enter every debate. You do not have to explain every decision. You do not have to prove yourself to everyone. Mel Robbins describes topic boundaries as a way to decide what discussions you will and will not participate in, especially when certain conversations repeatedly leave you drained or angry. That does not mean avoiding every difficult conversation. Some conversations are necessary. The difference is intention. A useful conversation can solve a problem. A repeated argument can simply repeat the same problem. Knowing the difference can protect your time and attention. Ultimately, Session 4 brings us to a balanced understanding of the theory. Let them is not surrender. Let them is not approval. Let them is not weakness. And it is certainly not a reason to ignore serious situations. It is a reminder that another person's choices belong to them, while your decisions belong to you. Let them have their opinion. Let me decide whether I need to respond. Let them make their choice. Let me decide what that means for my actions. Let them react. Let me remain responsible for how I behave. Once you understand this distinction, boundaries become less about controlling other people and more about directing your own life. And that leads to the final session. Because after understanding control, relationships, emotions, and boundaries, one question remains. What does it actually look like to use the let them theory as a complete way of thinking about your life? In Session 5, we will bring the major ideas together and turn the entire book summary into one final lesson about responsibility, choice, relationships, and personal peace. Session 5, Final Conclusion. We have now reached the final session of our summary of the Let Them theory by Mel Robbins. And after everything we have explored, the idea becomes much simpler. You cannot control everyone around you. You cannot control what people think. You cannot control what they choose. You cannot control whether they understand you. You cannot control whether they agree with you. But you can control something extremely important. Your own response. That is the central shift behind the let them and let me approach. Let them asks you to stop spending unnecessary energy trying to control another person's choices. Let me brings your attention back to your own responsibility. Let them choose. Let me decide what I do next. This does not mean becoming careless or indifferent. It means learning to recognize the difference between caring about someone and trying to control them. You can care about your family and still allow them to make their own decisions. You can care about your friends without demanding that they always agree with you. You can listen to someone's opinion without allowing that opinion to determine your entire life. And you can love and respect people while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. Throughout this summary, we also saw why boundaries matter. A boundary is not simply a demand that another person change. It is a decision about your own participation. You cannot force someone to respect your time. But you can decide how much time you give them. You cannot force someone to have a certain opinion. But you can decide whether you need to respond. You cannot control someone's reaction. But you can control your own words and actions. That is where responsibility begins. And this distinction is especially important because, let them, should never be misunderstood as, let everything happen. There are situations that require communication, boundaries, responsible action, and appropriate support. The principle is not about ignoring serious problems. It is about understanding where your influence actually exists and using it wisely. One of the biggest lessons from the entire idea is therefore this. Stop fighting for control where you have none, and start using responsibility where you do. Think about how much mental energy can disappear when you constantly try to manage other people. Why did they say that? Why didn't they call? Why don't they understand? Why are they behaving like this? How can I make them change? These questions can keep your attention trapped in someone else's behavior. But the let me question is different. What can I do now? Maybe you need to communicate. Maybe you need to listen. Maybe you need to apologize. Maybe you need to establish a boundary. Maybe you need to change your own behavior. Maybe you need to step away from an unproductive situation. Or maybe there is nothing you need to do at all. Sometimes the most responsible response is simply accepting that another person has made a choice, and refusing to let that choice control the rest of your day. This idea can also change how you look at expectations. People will not always behave exactly as you imagined. Friends may change. Plans may change. Opinions may change. Relationships may change. And life will constantly present situations that are outside your control. The goal is not to make life perfectly predictable. The goal is to become better at responding to reality instead of constantly fighting against it. That is where the theory becomes practical. When you stop trying to control everyone else, you create more space for your own goals. More space for your responsibilities. More space for your relationships. More space for learning. More space for making thoughtful decisions. And perhaps most importantly, more space for understanding yourself. The deepest lesson here is not really about two words. It is about ownership. Own your choices. Own your response. Own your boundaries. Own your decisions. And recognize that other people have ownership over their own choices as well. You do not have to control someone else's life in order to live your own life responsibly. So the next time someone does something you cannot control, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, can I control this? If the answer is no, remember. Let them. Then ask, what can I do? And remember, let me. That simple shift can help you move from reaction to responsibility, from unnecessary conflict to clearer decisions, and from trying to control others to focusing on the part of life that actually belongs to you. And that brings us to the end of our complete book summary of the Let Them theory. If you found this summary useful, please like the video, it helps support the channel and lets more people discover these ideas. And if you enjoy thoughtful book summaries like this one, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next book. Thank you for listening. Until the next summary, remember. You cannot control everyone else. But you can always choose what you do next.